Well, in addition to Bob Long's leadership, I think Dan Small is probably also one of the leaders in the last decade or more in the state for working on this issue, and he has done a lot, and that's why I asked him and Bob to start out this symposium. So with this, I will share this. Dan is the director of the Natural Lands Program at Washington College.
Not quite the director.
Not quite?
I run it, yeah.
He runs it.
I appreciate
In
it.
practice.
Do I get a raise with that?
It says it on the agenda, so it's true. Thank you for coming, Dan. I'll let you take it away.
Yeah. Thanks, Luke. Yeah, so now that you know a little bit more about what early successional habitat looks like, Luke asked me just to talk a little bit about some of the species that can be found in that habitat, and then what their population status is doing in Maryland and kind of the mid-Atlantic in general. But before doing that, I thought it'd be good to share this recent report from the State of Birds from the North American Bird Conservation Initiative and other partners that came out in 2022. Giving a snapshot of the last 50 years of birds or species groups or habitat groups and how they're faring across North America. And with the exception of waterfowl and water birds, all other species groups are in decline. And unfortunately, grassland birds are kind of leading the way with the most severe declines. And so, unfortunately, this is not going to be the most uplifting talk of the day, but it's important. And I think while you're reviewing the slides and looking at those negative trends, just keep in mind that we can make a difference. Like creating habitat, managing that habitat can make a difference for all these species. And if we can emulate the success that waterfowl biologists and conservationists have had for the ducks and other waterfowl, like we can seriously make a difference collectively. So keep that in mind. So what I did is group some of those habitat types that Bob talked about, and just gave a few species that I generally think that can be associated with them. So native warm season grasses, generally planted ones. You're generally going to have quail if you have a population nearby, dickcissels and field sparrows. But keep in mind, these species also can be found in scrubs. So there's a lot of variation in some of these species on what kind of habitat they'll use. Grasshopper sparrows here on the right do like native warm season grasses, but can also be found.
Can you take one step to the left?
Sure, sorry. Can also be found in cool season grasses and pastures. And while they like it short and open, dickcissels, field sparrows, and bobwhite can handle taller grasses if it's managed. So there's a lot of variation in some of these species and what they're using. So the graphs here are from the Breeding Bird Survey, and for those that you don't know, that started right here actually at Patuxent by a researcher back in the 60s. It's expanded continental-wide, and they're basically counts run by volunteers on standardized routes that are repeated every year. That are counting breeding birds. And so these are all from Maryland. There are average numbers across the state beginning in the 60s. And unfortunately, you can see bobwhite are showing the largest negative population trend over time of all the birds we're going to kind of talk about today. Working grasslands, I kind of think of these as these cool season pastures and hay fields. Working lands for wildlife is pushing a little bit more incorporating warm season grasses into production, but majority of them are cool season grasses. And these four species, eastern meadowlark, Savannah sparrow, bobolink, and Henslow sparrows, tend to do pretty well in this habitat if you can get landowners and managers to alter the mowing regime to be outside of the peak nesting season. They seem to do pretty well. And that's exactly what's happening on a Fair Hill wildlife management area here in Maryland in Cecil County. The farmers working with the landowner or the state to alter that mowing, and I think they're doing reasonably well there. Scrub of this old field habitat. Again, indigo buntings, yellowthroats, blue grosbeaks can be found across a variety of different habitat types. But I generally think of yellow-breasted chats as really, staying strong with the scrub habitat. I kind of think of them as an indicator species. So if you're wondering if you have good scrub habitat on your property and you don't have quail there, Yellow-breasted chats, if they're singing, I tend to think of that as a good indicator that, you know, you're doing something right. Hedgerow is obviously a really important missing component here, or, you know, particularly on the shore where I do most of my work in the rural landscape. And by no means are orchard orioles or thrashers restricted to hedgerows, and there's lots of other species that utilize them. Vesper sparrows, as you can see, are really showing negative trends. And they used to use hedgerows from singing perches and things like that, but they really like fallow fields. So that old school way of farming that we don't see anymore, their population is really suffering because of that. And so research has shown they just do not do well in modern conventional, you know, row crop farming. And as you can see, the data supports that. Young forest, obviously this can be extremely varied based on species that are using it, species of the young forest, the actual trees themselves, and then varies, you know, kind of from the coastal plain all the way to the mountains. So the species components are different. Like, for example, prairie warbler likes young regenerating pine woods, whereas, say, woodcock or grouse are going to be, I believe to be found more in deciduous habitats that are young, right? And then golden-winged warblers kind of like it a little bit more sparse with some mature trees, low-growing ones with some herbaceous cover underneath and not too thick. But in any event, based on those numbers, you can see that these species are all in decline and certainly need help. So that's all really focused on the breeding habitat, which is, you know, we're always really focused on that to support populations and things like that. But there's other times a year that this habitat that we're trying to create and manage is really important for migrating species. I tend to think of bobolinks as a really interesting species because they are a little bit different than other songbirds, where they don't molt on their breeding grounds or on the wintering grounds, but somewhere in between. So they have to stop at a significant grassland, particularly the adults, for about a month to molt their entire body feathers before moving on to South America, where they'll spend the winter. So if you don't have this habitat, or you manage it in an appropriate time of year, you can really hinder them as a species. And of course, there's lots of other grassland birds that nest north of us that will also need that habitat as a stopover. They may only stay a week or two before heading south. So think about that in that period, that need as well. For example, here is the current map during the breeding bird atlas that's currently happening here in Maryland. Breeding blocks that bobolinks have been confirmed or are probably breeding in Maryland. The light kind of purple ones on the shore and a little bit further south are actually migrants that are coming through already in late July. But the darker colors are where they're breeding. But if you fast forward to data showing during the fall, during the migration period, you can really see how much more of the state they're using as they pass through. So you can't just really focus on where certain things breed. You want to manage the habitat appropriately throughout the year. And then, of course, you've got winter, right? So this is another important thing. If we want to support these birds, particularly quail that don't migrate, you have to have winter cover for them. But there's also a lot of birds that will move south into these areas that will also need that cover. So we need cover, and that's good habitat all year round to support these populations. And so just think about that when you're planning these things, and then subsequent management. Just got this one last slide that kind of just summarizes some of the things I was just talking about. 8 out of the 10 species that require grasslands here in Maryland are all suffering large population declines compared to a lot of the other habitat groups. So adding early successional habitat to some of these state lands, some of these private properties can make a big difference for some of these species, particularly the migrants, because they will find this habitat. So plant it, and hopefully these species will show up.
Thank you, James.